key issues in Queensland.
You're a pioneer.
Miss Shari Markson's Wuhan investigative documentary. I'll be watching it. I'll be back though tomorrow night at 6.
This is the Bolt Report.
Well, welcome to the show. It's a busy one too. Coming up tonight, British politics in uproar. A Conservative minister says men, this will shock you, have penises. And a Labor MP says women have cervixes. And both now face threats and calls for punishment. And I ask you, has the world ever seemed this mad? Brendan O'Neill will talk about that. France, meanwhile, confirms that we were idiots to trust them with our defence deals. It now calls on Europe to help punish it for cancelling, or punish us for cancelling its dud subs deal. And we'll talk about how serious this is. But first, tonight I'm going to talk a lot about Victoria. I apologise for non-Victorians, but I have to tell you, all Australians have to know what's going on here, because it disgraces Australia. It's also a warning. Our politicians are using so-called modelling, the science, to scare people into submission, to fool them. Well, let me start with the protest on Saturday, the anti-lockdown protest in Melbourne. I am absolutely disgusted by what I saw, and frightened too, by the brutal police state that Victoria has become under Premier Daniel Andrews. I'm frightened also by the failure of so many journalists to tell you exactly what went on, including this shocking attack. Police pushing down an elderly woman who's just standing there, pushing her backwards so hard that her head smacks into the road. And they then, two police officers, big men, they then spray this helpless woman in the face with pepper spray. She lies dazed on the road. Now, to say I'm disgusted doesn't even come close. Now, there will be a lot of excuses made for what you just saw. The police were provoked. This violence was an anomaly, and it was all done with the public safety in mind. To which I say, lies. Now, let me explain exactly what happened on Saturday and how responsibility for that attack goes right to the very top. Melbourne has been locked down now for about 7 months in total. It's the longest and nastiest lockdown in Australia. In 2 weeks' time, it's also going to be the longest lockdown in the world. And people, understandably, are at breaking point. They're not able to visit their parents and friends, and many are not able to go to work. Children not able to go to school or see their playmates. And on Saturday, hundreds of people, more than 1,000, gathered in a Melbourne suburb, Richmond, to protest. Now, it started off peacefully, calls for freedom.
Free our children! Free our children! Free our children! Free our children!
Now, for an hour or two, that went on, protesters calling for their freedom and reminding police that the police were there not to serve the Premier, but to protect the people. So, how did all that then get so out of control? Well, for a start, Premier Andrews has no patience for people exercising their timeless right to protest. Protesters now face fines of $5,000. Trains and trams into Melbourne on Saturday were even cut to stop people gathering. And the police in Victoria have been making sure to paint the protesters as crazies, as enemies of the people, as inherently violent, as tinfoil hat nutters. And on Saturday, around 2,000 police were sent to crush these supposedly crazy, dangerous protesters in one of the biggest shows of force that I've ever seen in Australia. And if some police turned up with a contempt or even hatred of the protesters after all that geeing up, I would not be surprised. Like I said, most of the protest was actually peaceful. But then police got behind and in front of protesters trapped in a ravine. And these protesters had a choice. They either did nothing, just stood there and face huge fines, or maybe they could make a run for it. Well, they ran. And yes, some police were then injured in the stampede, were trampled and knocked over, which is something I am very sorry happened. It should not happen. The police do not deserve that treatment. But neither did the protesters. I don't want to sugarcoat what happened. A few protests were indeed violent. In fact, I'm going to start a few clips by showing you one protester even seemingly trying to kick a police officer on the ground. But also then you'll see some of the scenes of violence afterwards, including police violence, haymaker punches and uppercuts, and then another officer apparently taking random swings at the heads of protesters running past. And then other police chasing and piling onto a man who stopped running, turned around, put up his hands, surrendered, and then bang on the ground. But let's go back to that woman who was pushed to the ground backwards. Now, you can see her earlier walking with some other women quite peacefully, and then standing in the street, an Australian flag tied around her neck, again peacefully watching the police, until suddenly, bang, hurled backwards and sprayed not by one but two officers right in the face, even though she was now no threat to anyone. In fact, she was still lying on the ground, dazed, much later. But let me point out something else about that attack. I want to show you from another angle. Watch the first person getting sprayed in the face, the man in the light blue shirt with the cameras, is a photographer from the Age newspaper, had his press pass on, and was shocked, he says, to be deliberately singled out for spraying.
Just comes at me and pointed at my face.
Now, he's actually one of a couple of photographers attacked by police. Singled out, they say, and the Age editor says she's going to now lodge a formal complaint. But the attack on a big man is one thing. I think the Age should join me in protesting about the more obscene attack on the woman. Because let us be clear, that woman posed no threat to a living soul standing there in the street. She and the other protesters, they were all in the open air. And how often have I said, an Irish study completed up to March 2021 suggests that just 1 in 1,000 infected people catch COVID outdoors. This is the biggest survey of its kind in the world. Nor was that woman a physical threat to the police. I mean, seriously, is anyone really suggesting that? And then to say that this violence to her and to others was done in the name of public safety? What a sick joke. This elderly woman was assaulted by police not because she was a health hazard, she obviously wasn't, but because Premier Daniel Andrews is furious that people won't follow his insane commands to follow the rules. But increasingly, I have to ask, why should they? Because many of the rules that Andrews keeps talking about, the ones that he has capriciously set, are pointlessly cruel. Ask yourself, why has he imposed the curfew on all Melbourne? What good does that do? Why has he limited outdoor exercise when people almost never get sick outdoors? Why has he banned children from face-to-face learning when not a child in Australia has died of this virus? Not alone. And above all, why has he banned protests against this madness? Because that is the last straw. You can't even protest for your freedom and protest out in the open air where almost no one has got infected. And there was no need for any of these scenes. Andrews and his police could just have let the protesters march, and then the only hurt would be to Andrews' pride. They would have gone home afterwards. Done. Point made. Off you go. Oh, you might think, well, letting them protest without trying to arrest them and spray them, that would have been too dangerous for the public. You know, think of the virus. Let me tell you, doing nothing is exactly what the police chose to do today. Do nothing when construction workers protested against the new no jab, no job rule of the same Andrews government. They protested at their own union headquarters against their union bosses who'd gone along with some of this stuff, it seems, and they had to hide inside, including the tough guy, the tough boss, John Setka. Now, no police in the middle of that protest, as you can see, until 7 hours or so after it started, when it got really violent. Windows getting kicked in, brawls in the street. I saw a dog getting kicked. So, Victoria today. Daniel Andrews, Victoria. It seems that pushing over a granny and spraying her, that's easy done, the Daniel Andrews regime. But trying to take on a construction worker, a member of a Labor-aligned union, one of its biggest donors, that seems to be a line that Daniel Andrews doesn't easily want to cross. And the lesson for me is that this police state is not really about the safety of the public, but the safety of the Daniel Andrews police state. And one final point about how so many Australians, and again Victoria is the obscene example, have been terrified into giving up their freedoms. Oh, it's the science, they're told. Politicians wave some document at them. The science. We see the same con with global warming. These scientific models, they tell you, obey the politicians or we'll die. Now, the thing is, as I've pointed out for more than a year, these models always seem to grossly exaggerate the true danger. For instance, last year we were told that the virus would kill between 50,000 and 150,000 Australians, when the real death toll so far, not even 1,200. Also March last year, we were told that Australia could run out of ICU beds for coronavirus patients in just 10 days. But of course, didn't even come close. And just last month, the Burnet Institute warned that unless new controls introduced in July, or indeed new ones in the future, unless they had a major impact, Sydney would have about 7,700 cases per day 4 weeks from that date. Well, the Burnet Institute was completely wrong. In fact, the New South Wales government has since relaxed some restrictions. Yet, even so, new infections have fallen from a high of 1,600, what's that, a quarter of what was predicted, to under 1,000 cases today. That's good news, by the way, under 1,000 cases. That's a huge fall, not predicted by these models. But Victoria's Daniel Andrews, get this, is now relying on this same Burnet Institute to justify telling Victorians yesterday, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to lock you down until November at least, and then I'll think about giving you just a few scraps of your freedom back, just a few. Can't be too careful. And that's despite the fact that by then we'll be 70% vaccinated, which is more than what America is, right? But one look at this modelling that Daniel Andrews is waving in the faces of Victorians should have told him it was another dud. It's junk. Because this modelling says that even if the lockdown in Victoria stays for the rest of the year, 964 Victorians, nearly 1,000 Victorians will still die of the virus in the last 6 months of the year. And right there, you know this model is junk. Because it is claiming Victoria will have more virus deaths in the last 6 months of this year than it's had in the 16 months of the virus before, when almost nobody was vaccinated and nursing homes weren't properly protected. And to add to this crazy, this institute says 2,000 Victorians will die in 6 months, even if Andrews very, very slowly opens up the state from November. And this is just unbelievable nonsense. And Daniel Andrews today barely even tried to defend it.
Modelling is about trying to predict things, so there's always a caveat on that. But look, my reaction when I saw the modelling was that we are right to have a national plan that steps this out. We're right to have a national plan that looks at 70 and 80, because even at 70 and 80, so not 60 or 50, even at 70 and 80, there's a really significant pressure on our health system. It cannot be a race to open up, because we'll finish up overwhelming our hospital system.
Victorians are being fed totally alarmist rubbish, these models, to justify being locked up for even longer. And excuse me, that last bit that Andrew said, no one should be locked up just to ease pressure on doctors and nurses in hospitals. Not in Victoria, not now. Not after a year and a half. The government should have been making the hospital system adjust so that people can be free. The people exist not to make life easier for the hospitals. The hospitals should be there to make life easier for the people. And I don't believe anything that this Premier says anymore, nor Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland, by the way. Right now in Victoria, there are 59 people with COVID in intensive care beds. Last year, April, Daniel Andrews boasted that he was giving hospitals money to create another 4,000 ICU beds, plus the staff for them, to cope with any peak. 4,000 new ICU beds, he boasted then, he'd just created. Just 59 being used today. Yet he now says the state must stay in lockdown to stop the system from coming under strain. So was the Premier lying then about all these thousands of ICU beds that he created and that somehow I can't see anymore? Or is the Premier lying now when he says they're under stress? Either way, Victorians are being played for fools. But let me go back to the violence we saw from both police and protesters at the Freedom Rally in Melbourne on the weekend. And I fear there may be more to come if the Victorian government doesn't stop acting like third world autocrats. Now, I'm not the only one who worries about this. Kel Glare is a former Chief of Victoria Police, now Chairman of the Community Advocacy Alliance, and he joins me now. Kel Glare, thank you so much for your time. It's good to catch up with you again. You have just written an open letter to the Victorian government where you warn, in your words, that its draconian restrictions are causing frustration, anger, and loss of respect for the government, and importantly, for the police required to enforce these restrictions. What are you seeing that so worries you?
Response isn't commensurate with the risk, Andrew, and it's putting police in a totally invidious position. They don't get to choose which laws they enforce. And these draconian lockdowns, people are sick of them. There's a rise of civil disobedience. And we can't expect people to sit back and simply accept lockdown after lockdown, businesses going broke, people out of work. It's just not acceptable. It's not the Australia that I've known for the last 83 years.
Now, the protests on Saturday and the way that they were policed, is that an example of the kind of thing that's concerning you?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the tactics that police employ. That's the matter for people on the ground. But the ire directed and the violence directed at police is totally misplaced. If people want to act and protest, it should be against the government that has introduced these draconian restrictions and not against the police. The police are not there because they want to be there. They're there because they have to be there. And so they're in a no-win situation. And it's sad to see, serving police officers attacked for simply doing their job. As I said, they don't get to choose the jobs they do.
Now, I don't doubt at all that some of the police were attacked by people who should be jailed for that. I'm with you. I've never liked police being used as punching bags. The trouble for me is I thought some police seem to have lost discipline themselves. And I think this is part of the whole febrile atmosphere that's being created at the moment. Now, how much damage do you think is being done to Victoria Police by seeming almost like enforcing draconian, unpopular laws against very basic freedoms?
Oh, it's doing enormous damage, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it will take years to overcome the anti-police feelings arising out of this. And I said it's really unfair because it's not the police fault that they're in this situation. But it will take a long time to undo the damage and re-establish good relations between Victoria Police and the public. And that's a worry of itself because police need the support of the public to be able to do their jobs effectively.
Now, one last thing, Kel Glare. If the government doesn't back down and if it keeps pushing the police out there to do what sort of things that we saw on Saturday, if people are put under continuing pressure, I mean, the lockdowns are going to last at least a month and a bit more, 5 weeks, and then even then be only slightly eased. What do you fear will happen?
The increasing level of public resistance, and more people will take the law into their own hands. They'll ignore the restrictions. They'll put themselves and others at risk. And I guess that's understandable because we've had almost, perhaps now, a world record lockdown period, and our situation is probably getting worse rather than better. So it's been, in my mind, from day one, totally mismanaged from the botch of quarantine, and it hasn't improved since. It's all right to blame the people out there for the problem, but I think that the government needs to have a pretty close look at what it's doing and adopt a different path.
Kel Glare, thank you so much for your time. I hope next time we catch up in slightly more or less anxious kind of moments and issues. It's just breaking my heart what's happening to Victoria, and thank you for speaking up. Appreciate it. After the break, what really happened in Wuhan? Sharri Markson on the most disgraceful cover-up I've ever seen.